welcome back again to this the Habits to Build for Components. But the exciting news is CEX 2.0 is back. That's right. We're going to be in Chicago on April 20th, and we're going to be in Washington, D.C. on April 18th. Because we understand some folks have a little bit of travel and other scheduling things, there are a few limited virtual seats for the December date. But go ahead, jump at the possibility of going ahead and being with us in person. All right, so you're going to save the date. We're going to put, there already, Sarah's already gotten them. We're going to put those links right in so you can register. By the way, you'll notice if you bring an extra person or two or three, you're going to get discounts. So feel free. April and someone said December date, April 18th and April 20th are the dates. All right. So as I mentioned, our focus this year is really on habits, and it's habits to build in components and habits for us to build ourselves. So what I want to do is walk through a couple of those habits. We're going to spend more time as we roll out the year talking about some of these habits. We're going to start, though, by having a deep dive really on habit number one. So habit number one is about tracking key data and using it to make data-driven decisions. It's really about understanding what is the engagement by the individual, what are the registration trends, what are the program level satisfactions, what are the renewal rates. It's at its very heart, and we're going to talk more about this. Peter's going to guide us through the 5 metrics. At the heart of it, it is getting away from relying on the heart and beginning to allow the data to help us in how we're making our decisions at the chapter level. Habit number 2 is about using tech to streamline tasks and support the data connection. Now, Mark's going to jump in towards the end here and talk a little bit about, what does that look like from the Built Highway? But in a broadest sense of all, what we need to do is lift off the administrivia that is really weighing down our chapters and keeping them from being able to be user-friendly, keeping them from being able to really be accessible, to make those good decisions, and frankly, to alleviate the volunteer responsibility, which allows us then, of course, to get more volunteers. So streamlining tasks is one way. And our chapters can be really nervous about tech. And so as we go through this year, we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to share some more tech examples. And as I said, Mark is going to be on shortly. Habit number 3. Okay, this can be a little bit can make some maybe chapter leaders a little unhappy, a little uncomfortable, maybe unhappy too. It's about making sure they're making the connection to the larger community. A large part of what we hear is that there's some silos. And the problem with the silos, if I'm a member and I connect at the local level and don't get everything I want, I may drop out. But if the chapter can show how being part of the chapter really opens up doors and connects them nationally and maybe globally, what a significant difference that is, both for the health of the chapter as well as the health of the organization, and is truly member connected. So it's about sharing the big picture. It's about really supporting collaboration rather than competition. And so that's a habit that it's a little bit more difficult, yes, for us to nurture in our chapters, but it will go a long way to driving their success. Habit number 4. And this is one you've heard us talk about, and we have done webinars and blog posts on this, but it is about helping our chapters really orient, onboard, and train their volunteers. Too often, we take the heavy load at the national, right? Yes, Regis, you will get the deck. Too often, we we put all the training on our shoulders. It really is important and helpful, really, for us to teach our chapter leaders how to do that. Just came back from a wonderful 3-day chapter academy with NIGP. And one of the things we talked about was this, and we showcased one of their chapters, what they call the boot camp. Now it's a larger chapter, but they do a boot camp that invests in the leaders that are coming up through the ranks. So how can we do that? We're talking about helping them invest in the volunteers, making sure they're providing access to training and resources. And I'm going to suggest the thing that gets under, I should have circled this one, is tying this into new member onboarding, right? Teaching chapter leaders how to do new member onboarding that is a true stepping stone. So I said 5. Let's look at the last one, the 5th one. I think maybe I should have said this was the first one in some ways, because this is the idea of leading with the member. So just like I started off talking about data, leading with the member is also a data conversation. But the subtlety to this is leading with the member versus leading with the leader, right? Because too many chapters, leaders are focused on what they know, what they think, what they want, what they think others want. And I really want them to step outside their own heads and hearts and begin to develop a habit where the member is first. And so the first habit is data. The 5th habit is really about data, because it's about knowing your member through personal communication, as well as the wonderful data that can help us understand that individual better. It's about drawing members into the planning and feedback. You don't have to have a program committee, I say. You have to have a program, you have to have a program lead, and you have to bring members in throughout the year to help you decide on program and planning. It's a new way of thinking about volunteerism that allows us to connect with the member. And finally, I want us to tell our volunteer leaders over and over and over and over again, and get them to understand and embrace that they are statistically different. Because they are statistically different, it is all that much more critical that they lead with the member. So 5 habits. And as I said, number 1 and number 5 really kind of are talking about the same thing. Before I connect over to Peter, because I want Peter to go deeper into the 4 metrics and the trends, I want to ask you a question. And so let me get a quick poll going up here. Of these 5 habits, when you think about 2023 and where you're going to be focusing some of your training and coaching and communications and coordination, which of these is a habit that you really feel like your chapters need most work on? And I'm interested in this for a couple of reasons. One is part of what we're doing this year is really being very responsive to the community in terms of how we're planning our webinars and CEX 2.0, et cetera. And so we can obviously help with some of that. But it also, I think, is useful for the community to know where it can collectively help folks. So I love getting the folks in here. As always, we love to give others the option other. Select other, go ahead and throw that into the chat. Thank you. I'm reading all of the numbers coming in, so thank you for that little bit of help there. All righty. I feel like we're just about the top of the list, and 1 or 2 more. All right. 3, 2, 1, and the poll. Let me show you. So pretty cool. So one of the biggest habits is orient, onboard, and train. That is going to be one of the secret sauces for them solving their succession planning issues, right? Data, then tech, and then we've got lead with the member and make the connection. All right. So let's go with lead with the data, and let's have Peter help us with do a deeper conversation on this. And then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about tech. All right, Peter, you're up.
Okay, now you're seeing the right screen?
No, Peter, I think you need to switch it.
Okay, let me see if I can do this. There we go. How about that? Is that better?
Looks good.
Looks good. Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And obviously Peggy has set this up very nicely. We want to talk about metrics and trends to watch. We're really talking about data and what do we know about our members, but more importantly, what do we know about how they behave? And that's a place where you probably heard Peggy and me rant far too often about the level of dysfunction almost and fragmentation that exists in our understanding of what's actually going on at the chapter level. And quite frankly, the extent to which chapter leaders even have a clear sense of what's going on in their space. And a lot of times it's simply because they're relying on their heart, as Peggy said, rather than the data. And we want to try to emphasize ways in which we can focus more on the data and potentially make better decisions about how we're allocating our resources, especially our very limited and precious volunteer time. So we want, as we begin to look at this data conversation, we want to think about certain principles that help ensure that we are, in fact, using this data properly. So the first thing we want to start with, obviously, is when we collect data, we want to make it worth our time, and we want to make it worth the volunteers' time. A lot of times we send surveys out to chapter leaders, we ask them questions, and they go, "Oh, geez, I've got so many other things to worry about. Do I have to do this now?" And that results in, obviously, a data deficit for us and some frustration on their part, and quite frankly, on our part as well. So let's really focus on counting the things that count. And you've probably heard me say this many, many times, but you also have to count the things you can count. And finding the Goldilocks spot between those two things is really important. So very often, people will count how many registrations did I get, rather than counting how many people actually showed up, or actually more importantly, for how many people was the event worthwhile. That's perhaps the most worthwhile metric to count of all the metrics, but it's a difficult one to count. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but really looking at what actually counts and what you can count, and finding that sweet spot between those two is critical. The third thing we want to be sure we do is to count and report consistently and graphically. Very often I'll look at the reports that are sent by associations to their chapter leaders, and there are these long lists of names and stuff, and just reams of data that just make your eyes glass over. And all that data can be presented graphically in a way that's much more inspirational and exciting and actually clearer in terms of the message we're trying to deliver. So when we think about giving a report to a chapter leader, let's think first about what is it we want the chapter leader to be able to do with this information? What decision do we want them to be able to make? Where do we want them to go? Let's make sure that our reports are helping move them in a direction, not just make them want to go to sleep or go do something else, grab a drink. And we can also use that data, those reports, to look for lagging and leading indicators to begin to get some sense of where are things going, where might they go, where have they been, and how can we tell from where they've been where they are likely to go and make adjustments accordingly. And last but not least, and you'll hear me say this over and over again, we always want to check the fit. Way too often, the chapter leaders, and quite frankly, the CRP and the association community operate in silos. And we think of the chapters as this isolated thing that's operating by itself without any relationship to everything else that's going on. And sometimes we tend to look at our associations like they're separate from the chapters. But in most cases, from the members' perspective, they're not drawing this line. They're looking at the value proposition they get from the association. And the chapters just happen to be one of the delivery channels through which that value proposition is delivered. So we always want to look at how things are fitting together. And that's why the data is really important. We need to look not just at the chapter data, but let's look at the association data as a whole and see how those two are blending with each other. Okay, so let's take a look at the metrics. The first metric is member engagement. We talk about that over and over again. And basically, we're talking about the percentage of members who are participating in the organization in some way, shape, or form, or in this case, in the chapter. So quick poll here. What do we count? What should we count? But more importantly, what do you count? What do your chapters count? Peggy, if you can run that poll for me, and we'll get some sense of what people are counting right now. And there are always the usual suspects around things like registration, but sometimes, in fact, I'm working with a group right now where they have phenomenal registration numbers, but everything is free. So the registration numbers and the attendance numbers don't always match up too well. So sometimes registration is way up here, but the actual people showing up is way down here. We want to make sure we're, again, counting things that count. In this case, registrations don't count because registrations are free. There's no skin in the game for the member. I would look more at attendance rather than at the registration per se. Okay, so right now, and we look at our poll, and it looks like registrations right there at the top. Show, no show attendance is in there as well. People are beginning to look at volunteering. And I think that's really critical, particularly when we're thinking about volunteers at the chapter level, where Peggy and I hear over and over again the issues with burnout at the chapter level because they're overwhelmed by the load they're carrying. Peggy, I think the popcorn stopped popping now. You want to go ahead and end the poll and share the results? So yes, registrations, right? Everybody counts registration. Not as many, about half as many count show, no show attendance. And I think that's a really important one to look at. The volunteering is looked at. Influencer is one that we don't talk about, but there are an awful lot of people out there who are influencers. The question is, can we count that? And if so, how? Don't have any answers right now, but that's something to keep an eye on. Okay, let's keep it rolling here. Okay. So fundamentally, these engagement metrics are all about behavior. We do surveys, but surveys tell you what people think they want. Behavior tells you what they actually want because it's based upon what they actually do. And we also want to follow the demographics. There's often a story inside the demographics that we don't miss when we look at behavior without the demographics. And we can begin to discover pockets within our membership where we have a high level of activity that perhaps could be translated over to other areas if we better understood the who as well as the why. And in many cases, that could help us with membership recruitment, because if we see a cohort of members that look like a certain way that are participating actively, then I'll bet we could go and look at our non-member population, find the same demographics, and they're probably ripe targets for membership recruitment. And again, as I said before, check the fit. How does this match up between the chapter level and the national level and the overall value proposition that members are getting, or perhaps not getting as much as they should? Okay, that's metric number one. Metric number two, we're going to take a look this time at satisfaction. So another quick poll here. When do we count satisfaction? More importantly, when do the chapters count satisfaction? And you can see that a lot of them do it after most events, 1 or 2 times a year, and rarely or never is still running neck and neck with the other two. So that's always a concern when we're not checking to see if the members are actually satisfied. Now, that said, if somebody comes back over and over again, there must be some kind of satisfaction, or perhaps they're just masochists and they like being abused. I don't know. But in most cases, if they keep coming over and over again, we can assume there's some level of satisfaction. So it looks, Peggy, like we're beginning to hit our peak here. And right now, after most events, and I emphasize the word after most events, we'll talk about that in a minute, 1 or 2 times a year, and rarely or never is still at 30%. So it's almost a third where there's really not much measurement going on. Peggy, you've got your hand up there. Like
I just was going to ask, and just in chat, because I'll throw it in there, is that because about close to 70% of you answered that, does that mean that you don't know, or that they don't track satisfaction? So in chat, just share with us if you didn't answer, is because I just noticed on the poll we didn't give them those choices, Peter. So I'm just curious.
Okay. And I'm going to guess if you don't know, they probably don't. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, let's keep rolling here then. So one of the things that I like about like about Amazon and so many other online systems are doing this now. They're doing this little reputational 5-star, really quick. Hey, did you like that experience? It's not a heavy lift for anybody. There are 2 things that I like about it, though. From a user perspective, it's real simple. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. You got you finished your Uber drive, and you get a thing that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. You bought something on Amazon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. Takes you a second to click one of those things. Not that I do it all the time, but I do it probably more often than I would do if somebody sent me some long survey with a whole bunch of different questions. So it's quick and it's easy, but more importantly, you can do it a lot. And you're not going to get everybody all the time, but you're going to get a lot of the people a lot of the time. And over time, you're going to begin to see some patterns, some trends. You're going to get some sense of, are we on the right path here, or do we need to make some adjustments? If you consistently see 1 or 2 stars, you're probably going to go, something's wrong here. And I know that anybody who's wandered around the internet trying to buy something, they all look at the comments, right? And they'll look at the ratings that whatever the product is or the service is got. And you'll go, that only got 1 star from 562 people. Not thinking I'm going to go down that road. Whereas if it got 5 stars from 562 people, you're going, wow, that sounds like a no-brainer. So keep it simple. Let's look at reputational types of quick and easy surveying that more and more chapters are in a place to do, because technology is available for us to do that kind of thing. And of course, we want to focus on meaningful outcomes. As I mentioned before, just because somebody came to an event doesn't mean, and they said they were satisfied, doesn't mean the event was actually good for them. So the more meaningful question is, did this participation help you do your job better, faster, cheaper? Did it make your life better? Did it make your child stop waking up in the middle of the night? Did it make your spouse love you more? Did it make your dinner taste better? I don't know what it might be, but when we look at meaningful outcomes, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with the programs that we're involving our members in? And are those outcomes actually being achieved? So satisfaction is nice to hear about, but I'd much rather hear, I went through this program and I got a promotion and a big raise. That to me is a meaningful outcome. If we can deliver that kind of outcome on a consistent basis, that's really powerful. Now, you can't always get that kind of information with a poll, and sometimes the impact of whatever it is you're doing doesn't show up for several months. So I'm going to suggest another way of reaching out and finding out what's going on with your members is to actually ask them how things are going and the extent to which they're getting what they need from your organization. The opportunity with the conversation is you get to ask the clarifying question. And of course, the member gets to ask the clarifying question too, but that allows you to drill a little bit deeper. Now, you're not doing a census. You're not going to ask everybody that kind of this all the time, but you can ask some people these questions on a regular basis. And quite frankly, I would say it's a great exercise for your chapter leaders to talk to their members and ask them how things are going. Rather than asking your chapter leaders to call somebody up and say, why didn't you renew? Far better to ask them to call somebody up 3 months in, hey, how's it going? Are we delivering what you expected? And how is this helping you do your job better, faster, cheaper, make your kids sleep through the night, make dinner taste better, whatever that may be that you're trying to achieve? So ask, let's make it a conversation. And then last but not least, I said this before, check the fit. How well is what you're getting, what the member is getting from the chapter, how does that blend with what they're getting from the overall value proposition of your association? Okay, metric number 3. And please, if you have any questions, throw them in chat. Peggy's keeping an eye on that for me, and she will interrupt me and say, hey, somebody wants to know something. Because I know I'm doing a bit of a fire hose thing here, but you'll get a chance to get a copy of the deck and a copy of the webinar after the fact, and you can listen to it again, or you can call us anytime you want if you want to chat. Anyway, volunteer participation. And this is just a subset, quite frankly, of the membership engagement piece. But there are lots of pieces we want to keep an eye on here, because as all of you, I'm sure, have heard, volunteer burnout is a big deal, particularly when it comes to chapters. So quick poll for everybody. How much do they volunteer? And so we're seeing right now, the numbers I'm seeing suggest that they've seen a fair amount of decrease. I know that some of the surveys, the industry-wide surveys that we've done and the research we had just finished with the ASAE Foundation suggested that people are still volunteering. They're volunteering differently than they did before. And again, chapter level volunteering tends to be its own animal. So that may be a place where there actually has been some substantive decrease as opposed to volunteering overall. And a lot of times it's because chapters are involved in what? Oh, in-person activity. And what happened to that in 2020? I don't know. Anyway, okay, so I think we've got the numbers here, Peggy. It looks like we have 80% have participated so far, and over 63% suggest that volunteering at the chapter level has decreased. And that's a problem. That's a problem for all of us. It's a problem for the chapters, it's a problem for the associations, it's a problem for the volunteers. because when people stop volunteering, it makes it much harder to develop a succession plan. So if we take a look at this metric, we want to understand what percentage of the members are volunteering. And if we consistently see that 1 or 2% of the members are doing 99% of the work, we know we've got a problem. If we can spread that number out a little bit, spread the load, many hands make small work, right? You've heard all this stuff a bazillion times, but we need to think about how we can restructure the volunteering experience so we can get more members involved. And volunteering can be a key element of a member's value proposition. We always, in fact, I like to say to people that volunteering should be viewed as a benefit of membership. Okay. We also want to look again at the demographics of the volunteers. Is there some characteristic of these individuals that we can lock into and begin to see where we can replicate that throughout the system? More importantly, or as importantly, are there organizations which actually help foster volunteering among their employees? They're the ones we want to get in touch with and figure out what's going on there. And can we get the boss of that company to talk to the boss of the other company, none of whose employees are allowed to volunteer? And of course, we want to use the exit interviews. We talked about asking before. Let's talk to people. Let's ask the clarifying question and give them a chance to be more specific about what worked for them or what could have been better. Okay, metric number 4. And this one is looking at, the money. And of course, this is a metric we do need to measure with our chapters, because if they don't have any money, they're going to have a hard time. And actually, sometimes having money is as much a problem as not having money. But if they're going to operate, if they're operating as independent entities, they obviously need to have a viable financial structure. So we want to make sure that the reserves are positive most of the time, but they shouldn't be a bank, right? They don't need to be a bank. And typically they need to have no more than 6 to 12 months of their operating expenses in reserves. When I see a chapter that has 5 times its annual expenses inside of a reserve account, I'm going, there's something wrong there. They should either have a big party, or they should, yes, they should serve the member better, because the point of the organization is not to build its bank account. Not a bank, not a bank, not a bank. Okay, enough about the money, because the money is the part that usually gets us in more trouble and creates more issues than anything else. Okay, metric number 5. This is the fun one. Member renewal rate, right? This is the bottom line for every single organization. As I said before, we can count lots of things, but the thing that usually matters the most is, do they come back? Because if they come back, it makes a difference. However, in the case of chapters, sometimes that's not always a good metric, because the question is, what kind of dues structure do they have? Is it unified or is it separate? In other words, if I'm a member of the XYZ association, am I automatically a member of the chapter, whether the chapter does anything for me or not? Do I have to pay separate chapter dues, whether the chapter does anything for me or not? And we've run into a lot of organizations where the chapter dues are mandatory, right? You have no choice. You have to pay the chapter dues. And there's sometimes when you have people that are perhaps in a place that's not well served by the chapters, and they get kind of upset that, I'm out here in the middle of North Dakota, and I'm a member of the Chicago chapter. How does that work? And I'm paying them $200 a year? What? I can't get anything from those guys. But if in fact the chapter dues are contingent upon chapter performance, that's a good metric for the chapter to look at, because that members are saying, hey, I thought you were worth it. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to renew. Okay, so we want to make sure we're tracking renewal and tracking trends. And I think I probably said this before, but we also want to make sure when we look at those trends, look at the demographics, not just of the individual, but look at the demographics of the organizations for which they work. If it's whatever type of organization it is, because very often it's the company that pays the dues, not the individual. And again, that varies, but that's a question we need to keep in the back of our heads, because sometimes the person to whom we're trying to convince that the value is there is not necessarily the individual who is the quote unquote member, it's the person who's signing the check. Do we sign checks anymore? I don't know. And of course, we want to use this to confirm chapter impact. And one of the things that we can do, even when we have a unified dues system or where the dues are mandatory, is we can look at overall renewals in the geographic areas that are served by the chapters. So if, let's say we have a unified dues system, and I look at the members from the state of Maryland, and the Maryland chapters knocking it out of the park because everybody in Maryland renews all the time. But I go out to, I don't want to mention a state that begins with the letter Z, wherever that may be. The members in that area don't renew very much, and their chapter really stinks. So we need to look at that and see, to what extent is the chapter having an impact on overall membership renewal and retention? And I think that's critical for us from a data perspective to look at the value proposition of the chapter in the context of the organization as a whole. This is all coming back to checking the fit. What's the correlation between renewal and chapter performance on metrics? So we begin to look at this renewal number and bounce it against all those other metrics we talked about prior to getting to this point. And of course, we want to check the fit, right? Check the fit. It's a value proposition. It's not just for the chapter. It's a value proposition for the association as a whole. So it's all well and good to talk about the things we want to count and we can count and we can't count, or we should count or we shouldn't count. That's great. But if you don't have systems in place that allow you to do that, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Mark
Peter,
Cuban
before you do that
right now, and we can talk about
Peter,
how you get component data.
I was just going to ask before we brought Mark on,
Okay,
because you went through those 5 metrics very quickly.
I
So if
did.
we have some time, and I just was going to ask real quickly, is there any questions that anybody has for Peter on those metrics? And while we're doing that, I will switch the screen so we can get Mark set up.
And I have no idea the dinner metric. I'm not really sure about. I'm the one that's usually responsible for fixing dinners. And so I found out pretty quickly whether or not that's a good metric for me.
Any questions? Sounds like not. Okay.
Okay.
I mean, there we go.
Oh.
Talk more about reach out to talk more about the value proposition at the chapter level and how to define that. April, that is an oh so important question, and it does come to, I think, Peter, you were mentioning about the talking to the members. It's going to be really about getting the members' voice in that.
And Peggy, if I can just, since we've got an extra minute here, I think that really lends itself to the conversation about the ROI, the return on investment of the chapters to the organization as a whole. And I think very often organizations allocate a lot of resources to support for the chapters without having a clear sense of, are the chapters actually worth it?
Yeah.
If they're not worth it, maybe they shouldn't do that. Or maybe if they spent more in the right way, they would get a better ROI from their chapters. But until you actually go out and try to measure that, you're sort of shooting in the dark and not really having a good answer to that question. I'll often ask a CEO, why do you spend X number of dollars? I don't know, $100,000 or $500,000 on your chapters. And they'll say, well, because that's what we spent last year. And I say, well, I'm not sure the CFO is going to like that answer. So let's see if we can't come up with a better answer to that question. And there is a way we can do that. And we have an ROI process that we've developed over the years that if you have questions about it, don't hesitate to ask us. I think it's an important issue at the strategic level to make sure you have your heads around.
And April, we should definitely talk a little bit more. We owe you a conversation anyway. So excellent. But the neat thing about both the ROI and the data that you were just talking about is that there are solutions out there, and I think that's what Mark might be able to give us a little insight on. Mark, how are you doing today? It's great to see you.
I'm doing well. This conversation is making me miss CX. I'm seeing all of these questions. Each one of these questions, we could spend an hour talking about, right? So Vanessa, I'm seeing your question about, we're seeing a correlation between lack of succession planning and chapters maturity, right? So if you've got the same chapter leaders, same president year after year after year, same treasurer year after year after year, I'm going to tell you that you've got a stagnant chapter, right? I mean, we don't want our chapters to be ponds, right? We want them to be rivers, right? So a pond has no fresh water, it has nothing coming in, and it's not giving anything out either, right? And they become these, pools of algae. And so we want to make sure that we've got new leaders coming in, that our chapters are giving. So there's so many things that we could talk about here. And I miss those conversations, and I'm looking forward to being able to spend some time on those in April in DC and in Chicago. But you all asked me to speak a little bit on how Bill Highway is a technical solution that can help with a lot of the things that we're talking about here. And I'm always nervous about giving a commercial for Bill Highway because it's not what we're here to do, right? So, but at the same time, we talk about all these problems and how technology can solve them, and then we leave it there, right? So I'm going to try to just take a minute not to leave it there. So the first question is, when I talk to folks about Bill Highway, the first question that I ask people is, are your chapters or your regions or affiliates or states or networks or whatever you call your components, are they important to how you deliver your mission to your members? Because if they're not, Bill Highway doesn't make sense, because Bill Highway is a tool to help your chapters be more effective in serving members. Right. And so we're a solution that helps automate and simplify a lot of the day-to-day tasks that volunteer chapter leaders have to deal with. So everything from banking to holding events, to chapter microsites, to filing 990s, to managing members, to paying bills and making sure that there's not fraud that happens, all that type of stuff that we just kind of burden, volunteer chapter leaders to deal with. And then ask the question, well, why don't we have more, volunteer leaders at our chapters, right? It's because we pile so much crap on them, which is important stuff. But in the corporate world, there's technology that exists to automate and simplify a lot of this, which a lot of associations that I see are doing it by paper, right? So how many of us have reports, whether they're annual reports or quarterly reports, that we ask chapter leaders to fill out to let us know how many events did you have, which members came to your events, or maybe an annual financial report to say, hey, how much money did you take in? What, all that kind of stuff is just one more manual thing, right, that we ask chapter leaders to deal with. And then we at headquarters get all this paper that somehow we're supposed to digest and make actionable and meaningful. And it just doesn't work, right? So what Bill Highway does is think of Bill Highway as a chapter in a box solution for your chapters or affiliates to do everything that they need to do regarding just running their chapter. And we make it so much easier. So one chapter leader said to me one time, I was at a conference for the Women's Council of Realtors, it was a chapter leaders conference. And she said, Mark, I think of Bill Highway as my easy button. So remember the Staples commercial where they had that red easy button? She said, that's what Bill Highway is to me. But here's the cool thing, right? So all this data that we're talking about, as your chapter leaders use Bill Highway to run their chapter, we organically in our system begin to collect data. So we know which members are engaging at the chapter level and which aren't. And I would tell you which aren't is more important sometimes than which are, because they're your at-risk members for retention, right? So we all measure retention. You can ask anyone in the association, what's your retention rate? Oh, it's 82%, or oh, it's 72%, or whatever that is. But nobody's really, some are, but not a lot of people are really driving the leading indicators that impact retention, right? So if we're talking about this as economists, got leading indicators and lagging indicators. Lagging indicators is retention is what happened last year. Tell me the things that you're driving today and this month and this quarter to impact retention and grow it, right? So if your chapters are part of that, we know how many events they had. What percentage of their members are attending events? Are they using their chapter as as a bank to just grow money, and they're not spending it on members, or maybe they're spending more money on board retreats than they are members, who knows? So I group data into three main categories. So I think of chapter performance data, right? So if you're using Bill Highway, we will know a lot of statistics around what's the average number of events that our chapters in our ecosystem have, right? Let's say it's 8. Why are these chapters having more and these holding less? And as a CRP now, I begin to get data that helps me more effectively mentor my chapters to improve their performance. Or why is it that our average chapter has 72% of their members attending events, but these are getting 88%? What can I do to help understand these? We call them at Bill Highway, we call them bright spots, right? I think we've had a webinar on bright spots before. What can I do to help understand what these bright spots are doing so that I can move everyone's game higher? Or our average chapter gets 14% of its revenue from sponsorship money, but I've got 10 chapters down here that aren't getting any revenue from sponsorship. And I want to change that, right? Because we want to get non-dues revenue. So as you allow your chapters to use Bill Highway to make the job of your chapter leader easier and better serve members, our system organically collects chapter performance data, member engagement data, and chapter financial data. And to whatever extent the headquarters organization wants to see this data, then we create visibility into that. And so I'm regularly surprised at how much of a black hole member engagement at the chapter level is, chapter performance is. It would be like if Walmart headquarters out in Arkansas said, yeah, we've got stores all over, the country, but we have no idea how they're performing. We don't know how much money they're making. We don't know how much they're selling, right? It's just, we don't have any visibility into it. But for some reason, we tolerate that in the association community. And I think we tolerate because we don't know that a better option exists, right? So I don't think any of us are comfortable with it, but we don't know what else to do. And so Bill Highway kind of serves that purpose of helping our chapters perform better while very easily allowing us to see the metrics of how they're doing so that we can get in and help them. Does that help? So if we want to talk more about that at any point in time, reach out to us. Again, I don't want to make this a commercial about Bill Highway, but I want to kind of just put a stamp on data is important. We have to, as an organization, make data-driven decisions. So, Peter, to your point, we can tell a CFO, this is how much you're spending on chapters, and this is what you're getting back, right? And it ought to, as our chapters perform better, it ought to drive revenue. Retention should go up. Members should become more engaged. All of those positive things that we're trying to impact are very hard to impact if you don't have the data. So sorry if I feel passionate about this. I'm so passionate about it. We love our chapters. We don't care if you own your chapters, if your chapters are their own separate legal entities. None of that matters to us. Bill Highway works in all of those scenarios. So
I appreciate Mark April's comment, because for sure part of the concern is the turf issues, the siloed issues. And one of the reasons why we talked about the habits that one of the habits at number 4 of at the beginning of this was to tell the whole story or to create the connectiveness. Yeah, I think part of bringing in a holistic technology solution, such as like a Bill Highway, or NIGP has done it through a website adaptation that they've done. However you're going to do it, you have to create that one habit / culture, right? That we're in this together. And I don't know, Mark, if in, I don't know, 30 seconds, do you have an example of an association that had to help their chapters think differently about this idea of turf? And I'm putting you on the spot there, but I know you've talked to a lot of associations.
Yeah, and I have many, Peggy. But I don't have to address it too often, and I'll tell you why. The cool thing about the Bill Highway solution is we can show 100% of chapter details to headquarters, or we can show 0%. So where there are those sensitivities to how much data do we want to see from our chapters and how much data do our chapters want us to see, Bill Highway can scale, like an accordion and expand and contrast to accommodate whatever the culture fit is for that organization. But to answer your question specifically, we've got to somehow help our chapters to, it's the relationship between chapters and headquarters, right? And so we may be separate legal entities, but we all have the same purpose. And so healing that relationship. So, one thing, again, not to give a commercial for Bill Highway, but I had a chapter leader say in a meeting with headquarters there one time, finally, headquarters is giving us something of value, right? Which is not really what you want to hear. But as you kind of break down those barriers slowly, and it's kind of a quid pro quo, right? So in the Bill Highway scenario, headquarters buys Bill Highway. We don't sell specific directly to chapters. Headquarters buys a solution and then offers it to their chapters to use at no cost to the chapters. And so the quid pro quo then becomes, hey, we're giving you a tool that's going to make every day in your life of managing chapters so much better and easier. In exchange for that, we're asking for a little visibility into how you're operating. And oh, by the way, that's visibility that we're asking for anyway. And today you're doing it, by paper or by filling out a spreadsheet or a form. And Bill Highway just allows us to consume it on our own without you having to do that. I mean, I know I'm watching the clock a little bit, but it's a great question. There's just a lot of areas that we could go with that.
So if I can add one other perspective here that I think is very important that we often miss with respect to the data, and that is that the data is as valuable and perhaps even more valuable to the chapter leaders, because they're the ones that are making the feet on the street decisions. And way too often they're making those decisions on a very incomplete picture of what's going on in their space. And they also bring to the table, they tend to bring to the table a somewhat myopic view, a paradigm of I've got to get in a car to create value or to generate value. And lots of times, lots of value can occur without a car being involved. And that's just one example of the limited vision that sometimes chapter leaders have. Whereas if they had a full data set that gave them a more complete picture of how the member is engaging, not just with the chapter, but with the association as a whole, they could better align the effort that they're putting out and their chapter is putting out to supplement and complement that chapter value in such a way that both their time and energy and passion would be better used. But more importantly, the members' value received would be even greater.
Right.
And I take it, Peter,
I
I take it one step further. If I've got 100 chapters and I'm a chapter leader, I would like to see how my performance is stacking against my peers, right? So why, again, we call them bright spots, but why are these 10 chapters doing so much better than I? What do they know that I don't? And unless you have data to look at, you have no idea where you stand in comparison. And it's not even for awards or some of the things that we give to chapters, but it's just, how do we help everyone elevate their performance? And without the data, you can't even measure it. So,
and if your chapter leaders are remotely competitive, putting somebody else in front of them is often the best incentive for them to find a way, oh, I can do better than that.
Or even if they're just passionate about serving their members, which I think a lot of chapter leaders, when they first volunteer, they're so passionate, right? But they lose that passion over time because it's almost, sometimes people feel like they're fighting up against a brick wall. I've got so many things to do, I can't do them all. And it becomes the tyranny of the urgent, and the data really helps slice through into what's important. How am I doing, from a metrics perspective on my most important metrics that drive the business? And then how can I spend my time focusing on those important metrics?
And I think that one of the things that we in this conversation we can't walk away from is that this is a skill that we have to teach our chapter leaders, how to use the data to make data-driven decisions. We tend to worry about have we trained them on the bylaws, on governance, on processes, and yet all of those things would happen if they understood how to make good decisions. What does good decision making look like? And then how do you feed data into that? And honestly, Peter and I are talking with an association right now that's asking us to put together a webinar on that. And a large part of this is because it is a skill. And that's the reason why we started this year's series. And I know we're down we're 5 minutes left before the top of the hour. But I just want to bring it home and talk about thematically what we want to do this year to help all of us take our chapters to that level where they're knocking on the doors and saying, how can we collaborate? How can we look at data together? How can you help me understand Peggy, what she's doing at National, and I can tell you what Peggy is doing down here. So now we see whether Peggy is significantly different from Peter, because we can't get Peter involved. All of a sudden you begin to open up doors. And so we're going to be, and I'm going to get Peter and Mark back again, because I think that us being able to have this conversation in a very rich way over the course of this year can really help us make a difference. And Sarah, thank you for sharing. As Mark was talking, I remembered one of those two, and I think it's really, thank you for sharing those links. We are a community. We don't have all of the answers, but we certainly have some connections to ways to find the answers. So I just want to make a note here. In order for our chapters to embrace the metrics that Peter shared, embrace the conversation that Mark was really getting us to think about, and in fact, to develop new habits, we're going to have to break some other habits, right? We're going to have to help components leave behind some things. We've done a lot of training, folks. Now we're going to have to say, okay, well, how do we create these habits? And so we're going to be talking about next month in detail these 5 habits that we need to break in components. And very quickly, the autopilot is the cut and paste, right? The autopilot is, I'm a silo and I got to do this right here. And I need to, and I'm not going to connect with National because I did this last year. We're just going to do it again. Autopilot is what's getting many of our chapters in that funk, but it's also what's keeping us from having these really cool cultural conversations with our folks. Then there's the poor financial practices, which are everything from kind of a risk management perspective in terms of how they're handling money, but in how they're spending and how they're making decisions about this dollar versus that dollar, and seeing an event because it produces dollars as better than the event that produces less dollars, but actually has a better engagement, right? So poor financial practices, which ties, of course, to member data practices that are missing. But the other 2 elements that I want us to really shift, and Peter mentioned this, and he's working on a blog post on this. So I think it's a really interesting thing for us to think about. Remember how he said, and he'll fix this if I say it wrong, but it is a chapter we have to stop thinking about what can we do by getting into a car, right? And the way you get beyond that has a lot to do with the feedback loop you have with members, but it also has to do with how you're using communication as a value proposition. What are you doing to create the community conversation? And that's habit number 4 that we have to break, because communications is an afterthought for too many of our chapters. And lastly, that we're going to talk about this notion of focusing on new and becoming a churn machine as opposed to retention. And I loved April's question. I think it was April a bit ago who said, really figuring out the value proposition at the chapter level. The value proposition is not a join, right? It's a retention, right? So we really have to crack that nut to be able to get that. Well, folks, we've come to just about the top of the hour. And so stay tuned for March. That link will be coming with your follow-up here because we're still getting it, still getting the registration open. That link will be coming just like this one. Everything Bill Highway and Mariner brings in terms of our virtual stuff is doesn't cost you and earns you. Doesn't cost you the dollars. We're free webinars, and it earns you 1 CAE credit if you are either collecting CAE, collecting hours to to sit, or if you are you're doing it. Oh, and can I just give a big shout out? I know I saw Wes on here, and I think I saw Shelley, and they're amongst the new CAEs. So, hey, woo, 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 woo. That just a big shout out for you two. Awesome. And I see a number of people on here who I recognize as already having CAEs. So thank you. Anyway, you know what, Wes and Shelley and Diana and folks, you just earned a CAE credit. So, and then we'll just go real quickly. It's the top of the hour to tell you, don't forget, register. Don't forget, we're here for you. So contact us. We're more than happy to chat with you. And finally, a huge thank you from Bill Highway and Mariner. Thank you for joining us. Go have a great rest of the day. Everything will be coming your way that wraps up this. If we can help you, let us. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Mark, Peter, thank you. Big round of applause for joining us today. Woo, woo, woo.
Ciao, everybody. See you at dinner.